Well, we're continuing our journey toward Easter with a focus on the Gospel of Luke. And our focus is to really just kind of take some time and spend some time celebrating and recognizing the amazing grace that we see in Jesus Christ and through his life. And while we certainly see that amazing grace in every single gospel that there is, the Gospel of Luke in particular focuses on the amazing grace of Christ as it is directed towards those who tend to be on the margins of society. Those that we may experience as being outside, not necessarily part of the main, and maybe even those that we might see as nobodies. And that is certainly a focus of this gospel. And it's so powerful to see how Jesus, throughout the Gospel of Luke, reaches out to those who otherwise might be seen as nobody and lets them know that they truly are somebody in the eyes of God and that they truly do matter. One of the things is for each of us to focus on during this series is that while we may not ever find ourselves in the margins of society the way the characters in the Gospel of Luke do, there's probably moments in each of our lives where we may not feel like the somebody we thought we were supposed to be. There's always a moment in our life where we might feel a little bit invisible. We might not feel like we're who we want to be. We might not feel like people see us or recognize us or engage with us in ways that are meaningful and in ways that matter. And that's true whether we're teenagers, whether we're in our work life, whether we're older. There are just moments where for whatever reason we might find ourselves feeling a little less seen than what we might like. And as we work through this series, my hope is that we'll also hear a message of hope for us if we ever find ourselves in that place. I want to remind you of two resources that we're using throughout this series that can help you engage with the worship series as well as deepen your experience of the journey through Lent. Both of these resources come from the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, and we're using them by permission. The first is a bookmark that's in your bulletin this morning that gives you some daily readings. If you follow those readings, they take about 5 minutes each day. You follow those, you'll read through the entire Gospel of Luke by the end of the week after Easter. In addition to that, if you go to our website or on our church app and go to today's sermon page, there'll be a Bible study and reading guide there. And this is Church of the Resurrection's Grow, Pray, and Study guide. And it takes each of those readings and says a little bit more about them. So it follows that pattern. You don't need your bookmark to follow along. It gives you the readings and then gives you some background information, some devotional materials. And if you've got some young children in the household, it's also got some family activities. So really great resource. I want to encourage you to use that. I think it'll help enhance your journey. Last week we started the journey by talking about how Jesus came into the world. And Jesus came into the world in the most nobody of ways possible. And if you weren't able to join us last week, I want to encourage you to check out that sermon, check out that message, so that because it kind of sets the pace and sets the tone for the rest of the series. So really want to encourage you to go and take a moment to watch that or listen to that so you can see kind of what we're building on. But today what we're going to do is we're going to see in Jesus a remarkable example for how it is that we can help someone move from experiencing life as a nobody to a somebody. There's something that Jesus does for everyone, but particularly as we watch Jesus engage with the disabled and sick, that gives us an example of what it might look like for us to help people know that they are valued and that they are appreciated not only by God, but by those of us that walk alongside them. I want to start by telling you a story about what happens to Jesus the first time he goes home to his hometown as an adult. If you were here last week and you know this, and maybe you know this anyway, the town of Nazareth where Jesus was from, it was a nobody town. It was filled with low-income workers, domestic folks who took care of the somebodies in a town called Sepphoris about 3 miles away. Most people who lived in Nazareth were uneducated, they were poor, they were servants of a pretty low level. Anybody who knew Nazareth at that point in time knew it as a nobody town. So Jesus, after he becomes an adult, he's baptized by John the Baptist. He goes through an experience of temptation in the wilderness. And then after he comes out of the temptation period in the wilderness, he goes and preaches through the region of Galilee. And as he's preaching through Galilee, he finds his way back to his hometown of Nazareth. And when he gets to Nazareth, he goes to the temple because it's the Sabbath. He goes to the temple and he begins to teach and preach. And as he's teaching and preaching, he opens up the scroll of Isaiah. And when he opens up the scroll of Isaiah, he reads these following words. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, given what we know about and what we just talked about in regards to the city of Nazareth, you would think that the people in Nazareth would have been very receptive to this message. They were poor. They were oppressed. They were disenfranchised, and in many ways they were held captive by those who had a lot more power than they did. When Jesus began to preach these words, they were initially very receptive. The scripture tells us that every eye in the synagogue was focused on Jesus. They were watching him with great intent, and as he spoke, they were impressed. And a few of them were asking each other, isn't this the son of the carpenter Joseph? And Mary? Had no idea the guy had game like this. I mean, they were initially really impressed. But then Jesus kept talking. And the more he talked, the more they didn't like what he had to say. And in fact, they got really angry. So angry that they dragged Jesus out of the temple, took him up on a high mountain, and tried to throw him off a cliff. Now, look, you got to be pretty mad at someone to want to take them and throw him off a cliff. But that's where they were. They were so angry with what he said that they wanted to throw him off a cliff. Now, I'm not exactly sure how Jesus got out of it. The scripture just tells us that he started walking, and as he started walking through the crowd, they just parted ways and allowed him to go down the mountain and to go on with his ministry. So what happened? Why would it be that these folks from Nazareth, when Jesus came, a child who was raised there, and began to preach a message that you would think would have been incredibly important to them and would have hit right home with them, why did they get so angry? I think there's a couple reasons. One, in part, what Jesus began to tell them was somewhat threatening to them. Yes, they knew that what he was leading them to and what he was talking about was a life better than the life they currently had. But in order to get to that life in its fullness, they were going to have to take some risks. There was going to be some things that they had to do, some sacrifices they had to make, and there was going to be some effort that they had to undergo. And they weren't sure that the risks they would face, the effort they would have to make, and the changes that would come were worth it. It wasn't that they were happy with where they were. They were not. But they weren't sure that it was worth the work it was going to take to get where Jesus wanted them to be. And so they'd rather just kind of stay put. And sometimes I think that's the way we respond to Jesus and his message. Sometimes when we hear Jesus speak to us and preach to us, and we know how Jesus wants us to live, we know that his way is better than our way. And sometimes we hear the words of Jesus and they're very warming, they're very affirming, they're very comforting, and we like that part. And just like those who were in the synagogue that day, when Jesus preaches the message of hope and life that hits us right where we want it to hit us, we've got all eyes on Jesus. And we are so pleased with what he's saying. But if you listen to Jesus talk for very long at all, at some point he's going to start to press you. And he's going to start to call you to make some changes and to make some sacrifices to get where he really wants you to be. And sometimes when we start to hear that part of what Jesus has to say, well, we might not get angry enough to want to go and throw Jesus off a cliff. But sometimes I think we get angry or resistant enough to kind of turn away and not listen anymore. One of the things that's happening in this story is that the people who were in the synagogue that day in Nazareth, they started to see Jesus as a threat. And because they saw him as a threat, they could no longer see him for all the other things that he was and that he represented for them. He was a threat and he was a source of danger. And that's how they saw him, and they couldn't see him in any other way. Now, we know they were wrong to see him in that way. We know that there's a whole lot more to who Jesus is than how they saw him that day. But how they saw him that day was threatening enough that they wanted to kill him. Here's the bottom line. How we see people matters. And I know we talk about this a lot in worship together. How we see people matters because how we see people often dictates how we treat people. If we see people as a threat, the way they saw Jesus as a threat, we're pretty likely to treat them accordingly. If we see people as something different than a threat, we'll treat them according to that. How we see people matters. It impacts us. It impacts how we treat them. But what Jesus does, as we're about to find out, is Jesus has this ability to redirect how we see people so that as we see them in the way that Jesus would see them, in the way that God would see them, we find our way to deeper and closer relationship and kinship, where we begin to see them much more holistically. I want to tell you another story. Not long after the story I just shared with you, there's a story in the Gospel of Luke about a leper that Jesus encounters. Now, the word leper or leprosy in the Bible means something a little bit different than what we understand it to mean today. We know that leprosy is caused by a bacteria. It's Hansen's disease. It's a specific disease and experience that someone may have in their life. It's an illness. Back in Jesus' day, leprosy didn't necessarily mean Hansen's disease. Leprosy just meant some kind of blemish on the skin. And they would define many things as leprosy. And so it wasn't what we understand it to be today, just any kind of leprosy, any kind of skin lesion, any kind of rash, anything that might appear on a person's skin, that might be seen as them having leprosy. And there were some very specific rules about how a person with leprosy was to be treated. Here's an example that's found in Leviticus. The person who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head be disheveled. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Now, when it came to diagnosing leprosy and deciding where someone with leprosy was going to live, it was the job of the priest. And the priest would make that diagnosis, and the priest would say that you need to begin to live your life this way. Now, I just want to point something out here. When is one of the moments in our lives where we need the most care from other people? When we're sick, right? I want you to imagine just for a moment that you've gotten sick and you've been diagnosed with some kind of disease. It's not your fault that you have, it's just a bacteria. You just caught it. And in this moment of your illness, of your fighting disease, you're told by your community that you got to go live by yourself. You got to take care of yourself. We're going to take care of you anymore. You're on your own. I mean, it was an incredibly harsh way to approach life. Now, in all fairness to the priest, what the priest was trying to do was to protect the herd. The priest was trying to protect the camp, to protect the people. And so for the sake of the whole mass of people, the priest or priests would send off people who were a threat to that and force them to live outside the camp. So they did it with the best intentions. But what was happening was for the sake of the whole community, they were alienating, even really just exercising people who were sick and people who needed care. It was devastating for those folks. And what would happen in the midst of this, and this wasn't true just for those who were declared as having leprosy. It happened to people who had all kinds of illnesses and disabilities. They began to lose their personhood. And so if you were living in that day and you were diagnosed with leprosy, you were no longer Brian or Jerry or Tommy or Julie or Caitlin or Paula or someone that you may know. You were the leper. You were the hemorrhagic woman. You were the lame guy. You were the deaf person. They began to define you and to describe you by either the disease or the disability that you had. That's how you were known. And the more you were known by that, the more alienated you became when it came to other people. You were just separated and cast aside because they began to define your personhood by your disability or disease. So there's this leper, and according to the laws, he's ripped his clothes, his hair's disheveled, he's covered up his lip, and he's supposed to be crying out, unclean, unclean. Why? So that no one else will come and touch him. Because if they touch him, they might catch it, or they would at the very least be declared unclean because they touched him. So he's supposed to be saying, unclean, unclean, but he sees Jesus and he cries out, come and save me, come and heal me. So Jesus walks up to the leper, and he goes to the leper, and he looks at him, and he sees that he's certainly covered with lesions, but he doesn't just see that. Jesus sees the child of God that he is, the faith that lives inside of him, the hope that he has for healing. And Jesus does the unthinkable. I know it doesn't sound like much to us today, but in that day, this was a really big deal. Jesus reaches out, and he takes hold, he touches him. He touches the leper. Now, instantly, this makes Jesus ceremoniously unclean. He is unclean according to the law, but he doesn't care. He reaches out and he grabs the hand of the leper. Now, I want you to imagine what that must have felt like in that moment for that leper. There's a part of me that wonders if that wasn't the greater healing. That suddenly this person who's been dispossessed because of this disease, untouched, uncared for, cast out, has someone reach out and just grab him by the hand, hold on to him. And then Jesus, while he's doing that, heals him of the disease. And all the lesions disappear. And he tells the man, I want you to go back to the priest and I want you to show yourself to the priest. And there's two reasons he does this. The first reason is that he needs to be declared clean so that he can come back to community. Because community is so very, very important. And when we're alienated from community, that is a suffering and a disease in and of itself. Jesus wants him back into community. Go get yourself made clean so that you can come back into this community that you're part of. But I think the second reason Jesus does it is maybe a little bit more subversive than that. Jesus wants this man to go stand before the priest so the priest can see him beyond the disease. To see who he is as a person and to recognize him as a person. And in that moment, this man who was by every law, every tradition, every practice, a nobody. In that moment, Jesus saw him as somebody and made sure that everybody who was watching saw him in the same way. And that leads me to something that's really important for us to remember when we tell stories about how Jesus healed other people. As many people as Jesus healed, there was a magnitude of many that Jesus didn't. As many people as Jesus healed, there were many, many more that he didn't. Not because he didn't care, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't get to them, he didn't meet them, he didn't see them. The purpose of Jesus' ministry wasn't to heal everyone. The purpose of Jesus' ministry, when it came to those healings, was to use those healings to point to a better way and to point to God. And so as Jesus would engage with these people that he healed, he was teaching everybody around them how they were also supposed to treat these individuals. And so in that moment, Jesus is showing everyone around him how they are supposed to treat the person who has leprosy with dignity and care and respect and grace. And it isn't just a message for those of us who don't have disease or disability that we're watching to see how we treat those who do. It's a message for those who have that, who have these situations in their life, because in these stories, Jesus is making it clear that they're somebody, that they matter, that they're important in the eyes of God. Now, I know that in today's world, we don't necessarily treat those with disability or disease in the same way they did in the ancient world. But I'm not so sure that we've perfected this yet. I mean, I think if we're really honest with ourselves, I think there are some moments and some ways in which when we encounter someone with disability or disease, we limit their full personhood. We treat them in particular ways. We decide who they are and what they're capable of and maybe what they're not capable of based on our immediate encounter with them as we discover this thing about them. Our family, our closest friends, they have a son, and he's in his 20s, and he has autism. And Nick, you may know Nick. He's been a part of our church for years. They moved away, but they come back every once in a while, and he worships with us. Nick is a remarkable young man. Now, if you meet Nick and you see him, he looks a lot like any one of us, but if you spend any time with him, you'll discover pretty quickly that something's a little bit different about Nick. He doesn't engage in the same way that the way we might expect people to behave. For example, Nick has this ability and this willingness to speak truth in however he understands it, whenever he thinks it needs to be spoken. I'll just give you an example of it. It is not at all uncommon for Nick, when he comes and worships, for him to turn to his mother in the middle of the sermon and say, "Is he almost finished?" Right? This is truth, right? I mean, I know you've thought this too. You have thought this. It is okay. You have thought this. Many people have thought this. But so Nick, on behalf of everyone, is like, "Is that dude almost done?" Right? When we hear him do that, while we're like, "Preach," inside, like, that's not really something you're supposed to do, right? But if that's all we know about Nick, we may find him a distraction. maybe even a disturbance, maybe someone that needs to be kind of watched so that that stuff doesn't happen, right? But that's very limiting. That's seeing him. That's defining him by that. If you come to know Nick the way I know Nick, you're going to learn a couple things very, very quickly. One, you're going to learn that that guy has the best memory of anyone you will ever meet. I can ask him, I've known Nick now for 15 years. I can ask him about things we did 15 years ago. He will tell me what day it was on, what date it was on, what time it was, what we had for lunch. It is unbelievable. I have no idea how he does it. He also does this thing which for me is it's great. And sometimes I just want him to do it, but he doesn't let me just make him do party tricks. But this is so amazing. I do not know how he does this. You can give him any date, past or future, and he will tell you what day of the week it is. I do not know how he does it, and he's never wrong. Nick, my birthday is October 5th. What day is my birthday going to be on in the year 2035? Tuesday. Now, I honestly don't know if it's Tuesday. I'll have to check with Nick. So he can do that. I don't know how he does that, right? But every time I see him do that kind of thing, I wonder, what else is in there? What's going on in there? Because there's more in there than I think we might know or recognize or realize. Nick is tremendously caring of animals. He has a nephew that he loves and cares for deeply. He goes and reads books to residents at a local nursing home. Nick is caring and compassionate and kind and loving and just an amazing presence in the world, right? But if we don't know who Nick is, then Nick becomes the disability that he's labeled by. I'm telling you, there's a big difference between the autistic guy and the guy who happens to have autism. Does that make sense? See, language is important. And there's something that's happening in our society today for which I am so grateful. We've started, when it comes to people with disability and disease, we've started using what we call people-first language. Do you know what I'm talking about, this idea of people-first language? It means we no longer say the autistic child. We no longer say the Down syndrome girl. We don't do that anymore. We name the person first. The boy with autism. The girl with Down syndrome. The man with leprosy. The woman with the hemorrhagic disease. The man who's lost his vision. The woman who can no longer hear. They're no longer just the leper, the hemorrhagic woman, the deaf guy, the lame man. We don't put the disability or disease first because that's the way the world would see them, and when the world saw them that way, they were limited by those things. And we know that they're much more than those things. I mean, I know it just sounds like a semantic difference, but it's not. Because it calls us and helps us to recognize the somebody that they are who happens to also have something else going on in their life that varies in its significance to how it impacts them, but it by no means defines them in and of itself. You know, a lot of ways, I think we're kind of similar to that group that gathered in that synagogue on that day when Jesus came there. I think sometimes we have our eyes fixed upon people and we see people and we begin to identify them as quickly as we can in ways that allow us to kind of label them and mark them and figure out kind of where they belong in the world. And you know, sometimes we can be accurate about that. Sometimes we get it wrong. And the people in the synagogue that day, they got it wrong. Instead of seeing Jesus the Savior, they saw Jesus the threat. And sometimes we get it wrong too. Instead of seeing the very real person in front of us, the first thing we see is their disease, their disability, the struggles that they have. And when we do that, even if we're not doing it to the same regard, we're asking them to go live outside of camp, to be on their own. We're saying in our own way that they're not like us and maybe they're not as clean as we are. No, we don't mean that. But it's what happens, and it's how they experience it. And so my hope is that we can follow Jesus' example And when we see someone who is different from us, who's suffering from a disease or disability or some other marker that may cause us to define them in that way, that we will move toward them, that we'll reach out to them, that will not look past what's going on in their life because we don't want to make that, it's okay to see that. It's a part of what makes them who they are, but not to define them by it, so that they know we really see them and that we're glad that they're with us. And what we may discover is that when we do that, they're not the only ones who find healing, but we do as well. Amen.